In less than 2 weeks, the current sitting Chinese President Xi Jinping is going to declare his presidency after the 2 terms. Now, the question really dancing around everyone's mind across the continent is, what about his political agenda? Now, we know this year, the year of 2022, has been very crucial and significant, not only for Xi Jinping, but also for China, this country as well. And mainly because this ongoing political and also this economic deadlock between US and China at this moment, we have not seen any positive or any feasible solutions from either side. And what about these noises under Xi Jinping regarding this pandemic control? Now, ladies and gentlemen, in this episode, we are going to answer all the questions. And please, first of all, allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker. It's Professor Flavia Lucenti. Now, Professor Lucenti is a professor at the University of Bologna and Department of Political and Social Science. Professor Lucenti, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation.
No problem. The pleasure is all mine. Now, Professor, I want to get started initially when I discovered you because this amazing article that you wrote and which is entitled, How China Sets Its Response to COVID-19 from Crisis to Opportunity. Now, we know that, again, because of the COVID-19, that the whole world faced this unprecedented crisis and altogether. But somehow China initially set a positive example in terms of controlling or even manipulating the situation. But one thing that we need to pay attention is the rhetoric under the pandemic. As we mentioned before, Xi Jinping has been a well-known leader across the world. But under his leadership, how should we understand the words and the rhetoric under Xi Jinping? And why do you think it really matters, not only for the people within the Communist Party, but also for the citizens of China?
Thanks, Phil, for your great question. Well, let's start by saying that since these new coronavirus are circulating in China, the Chinese Communist Party has been committed to showing great efficiency in dealing with the health crisis. So we have at the international level strove to project an image of China as a responsible power and to restore its reputation at a time when the rest of the world was blaming China for causing the pandemic, accusing China for infecting the world. The reactions of China was eager to prove its readiness and goodwill to help countries, including European countries. First of all, Italy, which were deeply unprepared to cope with the pandemic. So in so doing, China aims to promote what's called the mass diplomacy, infuriating Trump administration, which accused China of trying to transform itself from the epicenter of contagion into an international benefactor, which is what China was probably trying to do, basically turning what was a crisis, a health crisis, into an opportunity. And a similar analysis, I think, can also be made at national level, where the narrative of COVID-19 has been very, very powerful. So through this kind of narrative, my impression was that the parties sought a strategy, also in this case, to turn the pandemic from a crisis into an opportunity. And in my view, this occurred by creating consensus around the party's action by depicting the pandemic as a threat, being more specific as an existential threat to the safety and the well-being of the Chinese people, from which only the party could save them. And in particular, slogans play a crucial role in circulating this narrative. Indeed, during the pandemic, slogans have been displayed on banners in the street in major cities, and there were bans on social networks as people were forced to stay at home because of the pandemic. And what I think stood out of this slogan was that were remarkably aggressive, something like, don't visit your parents or grandparents if you don't want to see them die. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but some of them are really brutal. And another characteristic of the narrative of the CCP or the pandemic was that the party associated COVID-19 with an idea of an external enemy against who conduct what the party called a people's war, and comparing in this way the pandemic with a warfare scenario. And I think that we can basically read all these as a sort of an attempt by the party to winning Chinese people's collaboration and assent to its policy to curb the virus, the spread of the virus. And the more the virus has circulated, the more the Chinese authority enforced lockdowns and used increasingly high-tech surveillance mechanisms, from tracking tool to facial recognition scanner, voice recognition, which turn out to be tools for, maybe I'm exaggerating here in this case, but I think that we can talk about a massive state surveillance. Or at least, I mean, this is my impression. Let me just say that last time that I have been in China was before the pandemic. So that's my reading of facts based on my previous and present research, my knowledge of China, but please feel free to disconfirm what I'm saying. And please.
Yeah, because Professor, it's interesting that, today, based on what you just shared with us, when we look at the pandemic, I think not only that really tested the temperament of the global citizens, but also really put the word I'm looking for, it's credibility. Now, not only that we've seen the credibility of the medical insurance, but also we challenge the credibility of the leaders, particularly about Chinese leaders. On one hand, we've seen that under Xi Jinping, some parts or some region of China were well managed. Again, we were not saying complete elimination. But on the other hand, fast forward today, we have seen this COVID-19 situation bounced back and forth, bounced up and down. Now, the question again, everyone is asking, and again, you're the expert, and I want to direct the question to you, Professor, is, do you think today that because the pandemic is coming back and forth in this still unpredictable situation, does the pandemic actually elevate the credibility of Xi Jinping or the CCP, or that actually decrease the credibility of the current leader? As a matter of fact, do you think that people today in China or even across the world still believe the effectiveness of the CCP today? What do you think?
It's a very hot question. Let me say, I think that also in this case, we should do a comparison about what happened at international level, what happens at national level. I think that China has somehow recovered its reputation after the pandemic because it was able, at least during the first year of the pandemic, to manage the spread of the virus. I'm not sure we can say the same thing speaking about what is happening now at national level. I mean, I think that the zero COVID policy is increasing discontent among Chinese society. I mean, look at the case of Shanghai and then Chengdu, where lockdown has been imposed indefinitely. Not to mention what is happening, what happened during the pandemic and is happening still now, with regards to minorities, not to mention Xinjiang, not to mention Hong Kong. I mean, I'm pretty, how can I say, I live in Hong Kong, so I'm pretty sensible to what is happening also in Hong Kong and what happened in Hong Kong during the pandemic. And I think that it was also, the government used the pandemic also for curb the protest and using, COVID-19 restriction for forbidding large gatherings.
Well, but the professor, in reality is, when we think about those measures at the beginning, let's go back to the history, is the beginning of the outbreak. Everyone was very surprised, and no one knew what could be the most effective strategy to change the situation or trying to make the lives better, especially again for Chinese people. I mean, having this lockdown across the continent, across the nation was very hard to accept for many purposes. But after a while that we've seen the pandemic came back again, but without any warnings or without any effective strategies from the party. Now, why do you think today the CCP or the current leader in China has not changed any rhetoric or has not changed any principles or strategies in terms of soothing this tension for the public? So in other words, in less than 2 weeks, Xi Jinping is going to declare his presidency for the third term. How does that even help with his credibility if this strategy, if the content, or even the principles are now being changed or modified?
Well, let me say, in my opinion, my view, Xi Jinping now is deliberately disrespect some practices that before, at least in the last 25, 30 years, were current in China. And he's doing that in order to centralize power in his own hands and perhaps also for guarantee himself in power for life. Perhaps it's too soon to say that. We will see what happens in the next week, in next month here. I don't know. That, I would say, what was important, what was remarkable about the pandemic, it was that this was a kind of event that also revealed to everyone in the world what kind of leadership the CCP is striving to pursue. And I think that we can speak about an increasingly authoritarian powers that seeks to exert a growing perceived influence in the Chinese society. Well, however, I think that here the question should be for a great economic power like China, which no longer wants to be the factory of the world, and it is looking for quality improvement of its economic development. But it is still a country that does not allow independent thinking. So how China wants to really pursue an improvement of quality to excuse me, if there are no ideas, no creativity allowed, will this obedient society really the party to realize this? It's ambitious. I mean, big question mark. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I have my opinion about that.
Professor, again, as we mentioned in the intro, some critics, not only that outside the CCP, but also within the CCP, or even the people who used to serve, as the member within the CCP. And this is something that, and I quote from a person, that he said under Xi Jinping that the policy of reform and opening up has been the only path to the development and the progress of contemporary China and the only path to the realization of the Chinese dream. A couple years ago that upon returning to Asia, I began to come across the phrase called China Dream. And everyone on the street, not only that we talk about Hong Kong, we talk about Shanghai, of course, major economic centers and cities, everyone began to understand or trying to interpret the meaning of China Dream. On one hand, that could be a very patriotic perspective among the nationals in China. But on the other hand, internationally speaking, that seemed to fit into the nationalism. So, Professor, I want to ask you the question, number one, how would you interpret today that when we talk about the policy reform and also this opening up a development towards internationalism, and also, what about this whole China dream? Do you think that today the Chinese government or even the nationals in China today still believe that the China dream is still the guiding principle for the country? Go ahead.
Okay, I will start from your second question, then I'll try to come back to the first one. Well, I have another question actually to this question. I mean, do you think that there is the possibility to speak about something that is different from the China stream today in China? I mean, the China stream is not just narrative, it's a political program, an ambitious one, and it has been practically been imposed to Chinese people. So I don't think that it's really important how attractive it could be now, but it's the only political program that is allowed in China for now. And when in my research, I investigate about this, the initial spread of the Chinese strain. What I think that was really interesting was that how the China stream, through the narrative of the China stream, the current leadership was also trying to turn Chinese people into protagonists of its narrative in order to increase their participation in the life of the state and in the decision of the party. I mean, speaking about participation, I don't mean an active participation, a more passive one, unfortunately. And I think that is something that is really interesting, speaking about the evolution, for example, of the narrative of the party during Xi Jinping leadership. This tendency to include people, the idea of people, by putting people at the core of his storytelling, just speaking about the Chinese dream, but for example, let me mention again the case of COVID-19 when Xi Jinping talked about a people's war. And there are a lot of other slogans and tales in which people were protagonists. So, but what I think that we can say about that is that whenever people are displayed as the protagonists of the CCP narrative, they're going to lose their autonomy because they become functional to the transmission of a political message that aims at controlling them. So I think this is a bet that the political power is doing now, but I think also that the other phase of the other aspect of this question is that the people are losing, as I said before, the autonomy because the space of the civil society has been drastically reduced.
Professor, I want to go back to the article again. This is something that you wrote, and also you mentioned this before regarding the word slogans. You know, on one hand, that I guess outside China, some people interpret the word slogan as political propaganda, but on the other hand, it's really a direct message, not only for the people in China, but also for the audience outside China. But again, this is what you wrote regarding the word slogan. You say, and I quote, "Slogans have always been part of the CCP's political tradition. Many party leaders have created models or catchphrases to advertise a certain patriotic policy or thought, some of which have become famous." If we look at the history of China, of course that either you call it political propaganda or you call it slogan that really serves as the mechanism to motivate or inspire the nationals to be more patriotic. But fast forward, in the year of 2012, how much do you think that people actually buy into the power of slogan today? Because again, we're living in the age that technology is available. Online information is becoming more and more transparent. So if we live in this closed door society, I guess slogan, quotes and sayings could serve as an inspiration. But today, given the complication or complexity of the society today, how effective do you think the slogans or the propagandas are actually working, especially for the country like China?
Well, let me say that I don't think the slogan were just for China, but for a lot of countries and for a bunch of political leaders. And they work pretty well in the past, and in my opinion, they work pretty well now. Why I'm saying that? I mean, we are living in a society where the speed of information is everything. One of the most common platforms in which people share their thoughts, including political leadership, political leaders, is Twitter. And in Twitter, you have pretty rigid space in which you have to share your opinion with the other. So slogans are still key tools in a narrative of political leadership. I mean, just think about Trump. Let's America great again. I mean, perhaps it's one of the most famous, is the first one that comes to my mind. But there are a lot of slogans that still work, still have an impact because of the nature, I mean, of the main features of what is a slogan. I mean, advertising also works for slogans, because slogan is something that is short, well-defined, more or less well-defined content is something that you can remember, and you can remember it easily. So
in other words, I guess what you're saying is, because today that people remember, or people tend to grasp this catchphrase, and then again, on my hand, I guess my interpretation is still workable, but only under the condition that people can see the truth behind the slogans, where people are able to see the effective measure behind those necessary catchphrases. Now, again, Professor, let's go back to the article. Again, you mentioned, during the China Daily, People's Daily, that's one of the state-owned media, and when they try to come up with what they so-called China formula, so again, it actually expanded into curbing the transmission, highest priority, international cooperation, nationwide effort, and all society mobilization. In reality, those things sound so great. Again, when we look at this political changes in the United States, we always say, when the politicians brings policy on the table, it looks so great on the paper, but it is terrible in action. So I want to ask you the same question. When we see People's Daily that actually praise that what we called China formula, do you think that really represent the similar way that we see this political changes in the Western world and in other countries, that it looks great on the paper, but it actually full of loopholes in reality? And especially today, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, again, the one thing we can't deny is no country is perfect, and it's rather difficult to manage a country with 1.4 billion people. But again, since he is the man behind the car, he is the man as the driver, there has to be something that he's willing to take responsibility. So going back to the question, is it terrible to understand those China formula, or it's just always perfect because it has been perfect for China? What do you think?
I think it's mere propaganda. This is something that the party need to defend what it's doing, to obtain consensus. But it can be very, very far from reality. This is very similar to the question that you asked me about slogan. Of course, people can see beyond them. Of course, people are looking for something different. But it's a part of the game. It's part of policy and politics too. Trying to present as appealing what the political leadership is doing. And I think that is the point why Chinese party, but also a lot of parties around the world, dedicate so much efforts to produce a narrative that is attractive, and then, as I said before, can be read by the people and convince the people about the validity and about the legitimacy of their action. You mentioned the cartoons on China Daily, but there are a lot of visible elements that have been included in the Chinese narrative during the COVID-19. These are not only cartoons, but there are many pictures, illustrations that have been disseminated by the government press, to persuade a wider public of the success of the party anti-communist strategy. And they were powerful because they were accessible even to a less educated public and to a non-Chinese public because they were only images. And speaking about, for example, other visual elements that the CCP used in its narrative, we can also mention, for example, the construction of state monuments, like the memorial in Wuhan, which has been dedicated to the people who lost their life due to the pandemic. And I can mention a lot of them. There are also some elements of digital arts, some digital memories, which you can even interact, leave a sentence of, dedicate to the memory of someone you lost. So this is also a powerful instrument that political leadership have today at their disposal.
Professor Lucenti, I know you are very busy. Now, I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's go back to the pandemic. I think throughout the pandemic that another word was being challenged, or I want to be careful, another key concept was being challenged, not only that to the people in China, but also actually across the continent, which is the word called freedom. And we know today that freedom really can link to democracy, because when we talk about democracy, that freedom, it's only one of the concepts that within the package. Now, in China today, that again, when we talk about freedom, people are very much concerned about the future of freedom under this country. Even though that one thing that we can't deny is China has been very much internationalized. And given the fact that when we look at information sharing, when we look at internet usage, and given the fact, if I'm not mistaken, last time when I read the number, there are more than 7.3 million internet users in China alone. So putting all together, how do you think under Xi Jinping and under CCP today, the concept of freedom, it's being well presented or it's being well preserved? Can you help us to understand that?
Well, I don't think that democracy or freedom is really a buzzword in China's narrative. Democracy has been put with different usage that it usually has. If we want to speak about that, for example, we can see very, very briefly how the Chinese leader used the word democracy to describe the type of model of international relation that is currently looking for meaning by the object democratic, the possibility for no Western state of having a say in international affairs and be socially recognized as a matter of power and equal foot with Western power, especially with the US. And this is not quite a definition of democracy one would expect. And at an international level, of course, the word democracy is much more complicated. Speaking about democracy at the international level, as Xi Jinping is not interested in pursuing or regime change, otherwise he will lose his power, but it is self-evident. So yeah, there is a sort of paradox, we can say, between what Chinese people are trying to do, the internalization of China, the increased number of China users on the internet, and the effort also to escape the Great Firewall. That, on the other hand, as we already said during this interview, the party under Xi Jinping is looking for a renewed authority and great surveillance of the country. The space for this Chinese civil society gradually has been reduced, censorship has risen, the Great Firewall gets tighter, and in China today there is no longer room for humor. I'm just thinking about Winnie the Pooh that was banned from the web because Xi Jinping did not tolerate a comparison with him. So we will see what will happen, how the party will be able to combine its intention to impose a major control on the civil society and the desire perhaps of a part of the civil society of having more freedom and having perhaps even more democracy.
Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation by mentioning something that we talk about briefly. We know that less than 2 weeks that Xi Jinping or the Chinese Congressional Party is the meeting is going to take place, which means a great deal not only for the country of China, but also actually it means a lot more to the countries outside China or around China, because Xi Jinping is more likely to confirm his third-term presidency, which is very significant since he changed the constitution single-handedly. Now, so the last question is, again, by changing the constitution or by continuing his presidency, how much do you think that China is willing to work openly and also collaboratively with countries such as US, UK, and many other you called allies or you called it foes at this moment? Because we know that in reality, some countries are today economically worried about this growing China. But on the other hand, some countries are very confident about this, how can I say, unstoppable speed of this economic or this political change. So from your perspective, do you think that after this continuation of the presidency or after this meeting, is China going to bring more surprises to the world, or it's time for China to take a sit back and able to reflect on before taking the next step? What do you think?
I think that fortunately, this is a new and old question at the same time. I mean, China has always been a country led by one party. And so other countries, other major countries do not expect that this will change in a short time. So, and yes, as you say, it was perfectly right. Some of these countries are pretty scared about China economic rise. So China, not just China, you know, or other power in the international order need to find a way to communicate each other and to collaborate despite these differences. And I think that is something that won't change, as I say, in a short future, but they will try to combine their economic interests with the political ones. But I don't think that what is happening now at international level will somehow pushing China to change domestically. I mean, it's part of the relation of China with the rest of the world since, I don't know, the last 30, 15 years. So I don't think that's going to be changed.
Well, Professor, I 100% agree with you because, again, as someone says, we are living in this VUCA age. So which, again, everything is possible, but meanwhile, everything is so unpredictable. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Flavia Lucenti. Now, Dr. again Lucenti is the professor at the University of Bologna, Department of Political and Social Science. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online, look for Dr. Lucenti's article, which is entitled, How China Sets Its Response to COVID-19 from Crisis to Opportunity. Dr. Lucenti, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show, and we love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow the current political and social changes, not only in China, but also across the world. Thank you so much for doing this.